For centuries, Jews have lamented the destruction of their holy city of Jerusalem and their temple by the Romans, which they believed was the beginning of their long 2,000 years of exile. Exile is not only a religious Jewish belief. For millions of Jews and non-Jews alike, it is a historical fact.
So that's one of the most dramatic points that you can really touch the end of Jerusalem. And not only the end of Jerusalem, the end of the existence of ongoing life of Jews in this country.
But what has been considered as fact for centuries is now being challenged by archaeological evidence unearthed across Israel. Here, in the ancient town of Sepphoris, just 70 miles from Jerusalem, evidence points not to a people driven into exile, but on the contrary, to a population that not only survived, but flourished. So why has exile been seen as a reality for thousands of years? And if it did not take place exactly as told, then what accounts for the millions of Jews who over the centuries have settled around the world? And perhaps the inevitable question, what happened to the inhabitants of places like Sepphoris who were never exiled? Until 1948, a predominantly Muslim Palestinian village stood on the ruins of Sepphoris. The village was destroyed and its inhabitants barred from returning. Is it possible that some of the Palestinian refugees are descendants of ancient Jews who were never exiled? Every day, thousands of tourists flock to Jerusalem to experience the story of the exile of the Jews and hear again the version of history they grew up on. The Jewish rebellion against Rome, which led to the destruction of the temple and the city, the center of an ancient Judaism.
We're just reaching now one of the focal places for any Jew worldwide at the time when the temple was still existing up on top of the mountain here. The largest man-made complex on earth that could accommodate 250,000 people. And the need to accommodate so many is because 3 times a year, Jews would gather here in the high holidays at the most sacred place, the meeting place, the place to say, I am a Jew.
The story of exile begins in places like this visitor center, where versions of the Jewish temple are recreated in all their former glory. The temple used to hold Judaism's most sacred objects, symbols of the nation's covenant with God, the Ark of the Covenant, and the candle holder with its 7 branches, the menorah. But the temple was not only a religious center, it was also an economic powerhouse, with donations pouring in from the 4 corners of the empire as well as income from hundreds of thousands of pilgrims.
The city was highly inflated. It was very overblown. It had a huge population of people who derived their livelihood from the temple and the pilgrimage trade. And it was also a city which was founded on Jewish piety. Jewish piety was the currency, was the cultural capital of the city. We have to think of something like the Vatican City when we think about Jerusalem. The Vatican City it's embedded in Rome, but it feels quite different from the city that it's embedded in. It has a distinctive internal culture. And the things that are important in the Vatican City are often not very important immediately beyond its boundaries. And I think that the same thing could be said for Jerusalem in the first century.
We are looking at now the beginning of the Jewish people. Think about all those people that for 2,000 years were dreaming.
Jerusalem was ruled by its religious authorities, the temple priests, an elite body that was far removed from the spiritual piety they were supposed to represent.
Under the houses of the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, there are remains of a whole neighborhood, a quarter of the priestly class of Jerusalem from the time of the temple. Here, those priests that served at the temple used to live. And when you look around, you can see that those houses kept quite high standard of living, with mosaic floors and with murals, fresco on the walls, beautiful furniture. And here we have the people that support to be the spiritual leader living in beautiful houses, a good life, while there was so much of poverty around.
Jerusalem and the tiny region of Judea were only a small part of a far larger territory created by previous military expansion, forcing the conquered population to convert to Judaism. Jerusalem, despite today's common belief, did not represent the entire Jewish nation.
So the Jewish world has expanded tremendously. There were more of them. They were also in closer connection with each other.
And they were divided.
And they were divided. There were all these profound divisions. So, there's this complicated business that they're all in some sense part of one group. But by the same token, they're often at each other's throats.
It is so the main road of the city that was here. This city that was then the Pearl of the East, if I'm quoting the Roman historian.
The complex causes of the rebellion have been simplified over time into a single story: a Jewish nation which refused to accept the authority of a pagan Roman Caesar.
Of Jews. And so it was a way to say, we are unique, we are independent. You can rule us, but still we are independent. And that would be hard for an empire to tolerate.
There is one man who single-handedly succeeded in shaping the narrative of the rebellion. His name was Josephus Flavius, a son of Jerusalem's priestly elite. His book, The Jewish War, is the most important historical record of the time and has for centuries shaped the perception of the rebellion as a national uprising.
The family for which I am derived is not an ignoble one, but has descended all along from the priests. So with us, to be of the sacerdotal dignity is an indication of the splendor of a family.
For Josephus, the rebellion was the uprising of the ethnos of the nation of the Jews against the Romans. Josephus reflects this Jerusalemite perspective. He sees things from that angle. He thinks that the Jerusalemites are in control of the entire country. that the priesthood is in control of the country and that everyone is equally loyal to the priesthood in the temple. And that any time a Jerusalemite shows up anywhere in the countryside, people will automatically fall at his feet.
Josephus began his career as a military commander, sent by the rebel leadership in Jerusalem to the north to bring the Galilee into the fold of the rebellion. Josephus failed to recruit the Galilee's biggest cities to the rebellion. Jerusalem nationalist aspirations suffered their first setback in Sepphoris.
But the inhabitants of this city, having determined to continue their allegiance to the Romans, sent to the Roman governor and desired him to come to them immediately and take possession of their city.
Sepphoris's decision not to join the rebellion intrigued Israeli archaeologist Ze'ev Weiss. His findings shed new light on why Sepphoris and much of the Galilee chose not to rebel.
ציפורי משקפת את ההמשכיות, את החיים, את השלום. כלומר, זו עיר שבחרה לא לשתף במרד, זו עיר שבחרה לפתוח את שעריה לרומא ולהמשיך להתקיים.
Ze'ev's findings span a period of hundreds of years. They help us imagine a society which Josephus barely mentioned and chose not to focus on.
יש לנו עדויות כבר במאה הראשונה לספירה, עוד בשלב שציפורי הייתה עיר קטנה יותר, מצומצמת בשטחה. יש לנו עדויות ברורות לכך שיש פה איזושהי חשיפה כבר לתרבות האחרת. יש פה כבר נכונות להתחיל לקלוט דברים שבאים מבחוץ.
Ze'ev's discovery of the existence of a pagan temple from a later period, dating to the time when Sepphoris became a Jewish theological center, was nothing short of sensational. Around the time of the rebellion, Sepphoris also had a Roman theatre. In later periods, it had bathhouses and mosaic floors depicting human figures, all forbidden and unheard of in the religion practiced in Jerusalem and tiny Judea. Sepphoris and Jerusalem seem to symbolize a deep cultural and political divide, rather than the unity of a national uprising.
אני חושב שזה מוקד הסיפור. הקשרים עם רומא, כלומר, האם לקדם את הקשרים, האם לאמץ את התרבות הזרה במסגרות המותרות כמובן, או להתרחק לגמרי ולהימנע מכל מגע עם התרבות הסובבת, עם התרבות הרומית, ולהתייחד כקבוצה עצמאית, יהודית.
Josephus had come to the Galilee alone, expecting to recruit locals to his troops. Rejected by Sepphoris and forced to camp outside the city, he watched helplessly as his army disbanded.
The sense that you get is that Josephus is desperate to impose his authority but it's dawning on him, not very gradually, that he doesn't have any authority to impose. And he's left with small groups of people who follow him largely because he's paid them.
Jerusalem had intended to mobilize for a national war, yet the majority of the Galilee didn't seem to have any interest in a fight. Josephus found himself holed up with a small group of followers in one of the few towns and villages that did end up fighting the Romans, Jotapata. Archaeologist Moti Aviam has found evidence of the rebellion there.
אחד הדברים הראשונים שראיתי לנכון לבדוק היה האם באמת הביצורים האלה הם ביצורים שבנה ספר מתתיהו. ולכן עשינו פה מאמץ מאוד גדול, למעשה 50% מהחפירה ביודפת הייתה ניסיון לתארך את החומות. החומה הזאת שאנחנו נשענים עליה כאן היא חומה מימי המרד הגדול. הצלחנו בנקודות אחרות להוכיח את זה ארכיאולוגית, והגילוי הזה והמידע הזה היום הוא מהווה אבן בסיס בהבנה שתיאוריו של יוסף בן מתתיהו בספר שלו מלחמות היהודים הוא תיאור אמיתי.
We know that Josephus likes to really write up these episodes of resistance, which is quite interesting. It plays into the rest of his account that this is, this was a heroic rebellion. When push came to shove, the Jewish nation offered heroic resistance to the Romans, as is shown by the siege of Jotapata.
Jotapata fell on July the 20th, 67 AD, after 47 days of siege, its inhabitants slaughtered. The Romans went on for 3 years, brutally erasing every rebellious community around the country. Towns and villages that did not rebel were spared, and in the Galilee, they were the majority. But Josephus did not die with the people of Jotapata. His life was spared by General Vespasian. Josephus became the general's personal slave, taking, as Roman custom dictates, Vespasian's last name, Flavius.
Vespasian now embraces Josephus, frees him from chains, makes him part of his entourage, eventually brings him to Rome, settles him in a house, and has Josephus write these accounts of the Jewish rebellion against the Romans.
Suddenly, Josephus's version of the reality gained an unexpected ally. Having come to power by force and aspiring to establish his own dynasty, Vespasian was a new emperor in search of legitimacy.
The only key to legitimacy in this sort of environment, if you don't have it through descent, is what's called in Latin the jus gladii, the law of the sword. That is, a substantial military victory can make you a legitimate ruler. What this means is that it was in Vespasian's interest to have this war portrayed exactly as Josephus wanted to portray it. A great all-out war between two mighty nations.
Three years after he was captured, Josephus returned to Jerusalem, not as a Jewish militant fighting Rome, but as a chronicler embedded in the Roman army, invited to witness the fall of his hometown.
This city was completely destroyed and disappeared. And part of this very dramatic last moments of the city could be traced over here when the Jerusalemites tried to escape and save their life when the Romans slaughtered everybody. Here we are, and you can see the hole here and many other holes all along. Those holes were done by the Romans themselves, the Roman soldiers, at the very last day of Jerusalem, when people tried to use the underground drainage canal here to escape out without being seen by the Roman. How do we know about that? Josephus Flavius speaks about it. Everybody, one by one, was pulled out and had been killed.
To celebrate his victory over the Jews, Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus held a victory parade, exhibiting what was probably the most cherished loot of the war, the Jewish menorah. A proud symbol of a monotheistic religion he thought was vanquished.
The very center of the Roman Empire, that is the Roman Forum, the Capitoline Hill on one end, the Colosseum on another end, is altered in order to celebrate the Flavian victory over the Jews. And I think that it makes a lot of sense to see Josephus' Jewish War as part of that.
Among the Forum's monuments, there is this triumphal arch of Titus, celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem. Its stone carvings depict Roman soldiers carrying the temple's loot and the sacred menorah.
Josephus's sort of desire, retrospectively, to have the Jews unify as a single group, as a mighty nation, and rise up to fight the Romans, which was essentially a kind of Jewish national aspiration which never happened, resonated perfectly with the Flavian dynasty's need to have experienced a great victory over a great nation.
But what happened after the destruction of Jerusalem? Nowhere in his writings does Josephus mention the forced expulsion of the Jews from either Jerusalem or the rest of the Roman province. So why is it that exile has been historically perceived as a fact and the destruction of Jerusalem as the evidence?
הדימוי ההיסטורי הרווח הוא הדימוי שהיהודים גורשו מארצם. והזיקה היא בין גירוש היהודים לבין חורבן ירושלים. התמונה הזאת היא תמונה שהיא פשוט לא נכונה מבחינה היסטורית. הרומאים לא נקטו במדיניות של הגליה של עמים. זה דימוי מקראי שמבוסס על המסופר, על הגליית הבבליים ועוד לפני כן האשורים, אבל הוא לא היה מדיניות של הרומאים. הרומאים השאירו עמים במקומם, ותבעו מהם לסור למרות רומי.
The destruction of Jerusalem did not bring about the exile of the Jews. In reality, not only did the Jewish community survive, it instigated a second rebellion 62 years later.
Where does the population supply come from for the second revolt if we lost so many of the population to the first revolt?
Well, first of all, 2 generations passed, 60 years and more. That gave enough time to regain more people, and I would say that it was much more of a rural population revolt than the urban one of Jerusalem and the cities around. Demographically speaking, it's by far the end of everything over here. So what we'll do now is leaving the cultivated green area towards the desert, reaching the area where the people escaped to.
In 1961, an archaeological expedition led by Professor Yigael Yadin set out on these desert roads to look for the remains of Bar Kokhba, the legendary messianic rebel leader and his fighters, and for evidence for what he believed was the last sign of independent Jewish life in the country.
אני הייתי סטודנט לתואר שני בתלמידו המובהק של ידין, והיה רק טבעי שכשהוא קיבל על עצמו את החפירה במערה הזאת ובנחל חבר, אז אני יצאתי איתו כעוזרו הראשי.
Yigael Yadin, who led the excavation, was no ordinary archaeologist. He was famous in Israel for serving as the army's chief of staff during the country's crucial War of Independence in 1948.
ידין הפך או נהפך בזכות כל מה שקרה מאז מלחמת השחרור בעצם לסמל של הארכיאולוגיה הלאומית.
Today's program is a conversation with Yigael Yadin, professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University.
Funded by the army and the government, Yadin's was no ordinary expedition. It was an attempt to find the archaeological evidence that would confirm the legitimacy of the Israeli state.
You see, this search for the Bar Kokhba documents, which you referred to, Mr. Agronsky, just now, was one of the most fascinating, I would say, expedition I had the privilege to take part.
Yadin, who was a great archaeologist, was very much involved, even emotionally, with the finds here, as was all of this generation of the big archaeologists. At the time, that was just a continuation of establishing the state and the search for roots and coming back to the country. And epochs like the one of Bar Kokhba or Masada were very, very strong.
It was here that Yadin hoped to find evidence of the last stand of Bar Kokhba's men.
So here we are, just above this huge canyon of Nachal Hever, running towards the Dead Sea, and it has huge sheer cliffs going all the way down. And just to have some scale, if you look over there, you see the opening of the cave where those refugees found the shelter, and the distance from the top of the cliff to the cave is 350 feet.
And the caves are right in the middle of the canyon, sometimes 300 feet from the top and 900 feet from the bottom, and a steep slope.
The people who found the shelter there could not leave the place. The Roman made sure that nobody would be able to escape.
היה צריך לרדת קודם באיזה שביל צר שאתה הולך כל הזמן ומסתכל ורואה את התהום מתחתיך. אז להגיע לאיזה מין טרסה מתחת למערה ולטפס על סולם חבלים אל הפתח. אחרי זה לזחול דרך איזה פתח צר, ואז להיכנס למערה חשוכה לגמרי, באורך של 250 מטר, שהיא כולה מלאה עטלפים.
And then only we came into the cave where we saw for the first time the first grim sight of the last moment of this desperate war, a heroic war of Bar Kokhba against the Romans.
The findings were indeed extraordinary. Rich evidence of daily life of refugees who had hidden in the caves. Skeletons, personal documents, and even letters signed by Bar Kokhba himself. Yadin believed that he had found what he was looking for, the archaeological evidence of the last moments of the Jewish nation.
This was really, I would say, the last phase of the struggle against the Romans there.
And that was the last time, really, that the Jews, since in Jewish history, that there was a revolt that attempted to reconstitute the state of Israel.
This is the last revolt we call the second revolt, and actually 1800 years have passed since again the Jewish state was established here.
Yadin was articulating the official Israeli line. Exile had indeed begun with the final loss of Jewish independence. "22 years after his discoveries, Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin flew with a group of politicians and dignitaries to the canyon. The skeletal remains unearthed by Yadin were given a full military state funeral.
בשורה לנו, לכם, שבנו אל מאין באנו. עם ישראל חי ויחיה במולדתו בארץ ישראל לדורי דורות.
Both rebellions were used at different times to mark the beginning of the Jewish exile. Yet these claims cannot be supported by the archaeological evidence at places like Sepphoris. So when and how was the idea of a universal exile of the Jews from their homeland born? For answers, we need to go back to the Galilee in the decades after Bar Kokhba's rebellion.
מרד בר כוכבא הוא קו שבר דמוגרפי, מפני שהוא גורם קודם כל לכך שהאזור שמסביב לירושלים נאסר במגורי יהודים, וגורם גם לכך שאוכלוסייה רבה עוברת מיהודה, מן החלק הדרומי, לחלק הצפוני, לגליל, ומתיישבת שמה.
התפיסה הכוללת היא שבעקבות מרד החורבן, חורבן המקדש בירושלים, ישנה הגליה של אנשים, והנה אנחנו מתחילים בגלות ארוכה שמי יודע מתי תגיע לסיומה. ההפך הוא הנכון, אנחנו רואים שברחבי הגליל, ציפורי זה אחד היישובים, ביישובים אחרים, האוכלוסייה היהודית לא שארית הפליטה, לא משפחות בודדות, אלא מדברים על יישוב שהולך ומתפתח, הולך וגדל. האמת שאני לא מכיר בנייה של כנסיות בארץ, חוץ
Sepphoris flourished. But without Jerusalem, the center of Jewish worship and religious ritual, rabbis looked for ways to fill the gap left by the destruction of their temple. A family sits down to celebrate the Seder, the traditional Passover meal. Before the destruction of the temple, Jews were required to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the temple.
זה לא היה אפשר לקיים אחרי שבית המקדש נחרב, והיה צורך למצוא תחליף. התחליף שיצרה היהדות של חז"ל היא ליל הסדר. מה עושים בליל הסדר? מספרים סיפור. ויוצרים טקסט. לטקסט קוראים הגדה של פסח.
But this emerging Jewish tradition was being challenged by another group of people who also sat round the table on Passover Eve. Today, they would be called Christians, but they thought of themselves as Jews who followed Jesus. They too were trying to rethink their theology after the destruction of the temple. But while Jews tried to emphasize continuity of doctrine after the fall of Jerusalem, for Jesus' followers, the destruction was a divine signal. And it seems that from this belief grew the story of exile.
אחרי מרד בר כוכבא מופיע לראשונה הרעיון גם של הגירוש מן הארץ, הגירוש מיהודה, כן? אבל הוא מופיע כניסיון להסביר מה קרה ליהודים. למה הם נענשו בשני אסונות גדולים שמתרחשים אחרי הצליבה.
Now, in these circles, the defeat of the revolt and the destruction of the temple begins to be seen as a divine sign that God has pronounced a judgment against Israel.
כאילו החורבן הוא נקודה ארכימדית שבה מתפצלות שתי דרכים. הנצרות יוצאת מירושלים החרבה לדרכה החדשה דרך הפצתה והצלחתה עד שבסופו של דבר היא תהפוך להיות הדת של האימפריה כולה, והיהדות, היהודים יוצאים לגלות הארוכה שלא תיגמר לעולם.
In fact, long before the destruction, the majority of the Jewish people were already living in the diaspora.
The number of Jews who lived in Judea and Galilee is really a minority of the total population of Judaism in the Roman world. We know, for instance, that in the city of Alexandria, where we have some reasonable demographic information, that there may have been as many as 1 million, that may be an exaggeration, but there may have been 1 million Jews living in Alexandria and Egypt. Now that's a huge number and way more than the number of Jews who lived in Judea and Galilee.
Observant Roman Jews lamenting, like any other Jewish community worldwide, the destruction of Jerusalem and of their exile, despite the fact that Jews lived here long before the destruction of Jerusalem. Over centuries, Jews have spread throughout the world. But why, if exile began as a Christian theological concept, did Roman Jewry embrace it too, like Jews around the world, as the central tenet of their religion?
הגלות היהודית בוודאי לא נולדה בעקבות חורבן הבית השני. הגלות היהודית הייתה קיימת מאז ומעולם. כבר במקרא יש... המקרא הוא תוצר של גלות. המשפט הראשון שאלוהים אומר לאברהם זה לך לך מארצך, ממולדתך, מבית אביך, אל הארץ אשר אראך. אברהם הוא הראשון שיוצא לגלות.
According to the Bible, the Jews migrated to Egypt as one family and returned a nation. The Torah and Jewish laws were handed down in the desert, not in the Holy Land. That land, according to the Bible, had to be conquered in a cruel and violent campaign.
הדבר המדהים הוא שהמקרא מאמץ את זה. המקרא רוצה את זה אפילו. המקרא רוצה לתאר עם שהארץ שלו על תנאי. אם תתנהג כמו שתקיים את הברית עם האלוהים, תשב לבטח במולדתך. לא תקיים את הברית, אתה תופץ בכל העולם.
The Wandering Jew, an early 20th century silent film depicting a centuries-old myth of Jews condemned to roam the earth forever. This is how a Christian theological concept about exile as a punishment was transformed after the Christianization of Europe into an anti-Semitic myth.
באופן פרדוקסלי, היהודים שותפים לראיית ההיסטוריה שהיא, להערכתי, נולדה בתוך השדה הנוצרי, בכך שגם הם שואפים אל הרסטורציה שלהם. כלומר, אם אנחנו גלינו מארצנו, זה מעשה לא נורמלי שהעם יוצא מארצו. אז יש גם סיבה לקוות שנשוב אליה.
Centuries of persecution and later genocide, all associated with the punishment of exile, transformed the messianic dream of return into a political project. In November 1947, buoyed up by the United Nations vote to establish a Jewish state, some Roman Jews chose to celebrate the event in front of Titus Gate, an enduring symbol of the destruction of Jerusalem and the beginning of exile. A Jewish national dream had been reawakened. It was first defeated in Jerusalem in 70 AD and in the Bar Kokhba rebellion. A dream that was first articulated by Josephus and was picked up 1800 years later by Jewish nationalists. But to understand what happened when the dream met reality, we have to go back to the Galilee. Suleiman Abu Ali is returning to his village. He was 14 years old when he left it 63 years ago. Suleiman is accompanied by a young relative whose family was born in the village.
كل يوم الصبح والمغرب بتذكرني في أشياء مهمة جدا. الصبح بكير كنت تسمع الناس اللي رايحة على الحراث، وقت الحراث بينادوا كل واحد على مرته من الطابون، هاتنا ولين رغيف خبز، الخبزات بدنا نروح على الحراث وروح على الحراث. كل هاي الأشياء الصبح والمغرب. كل هاي المغرب والصبح تذكرني في هاي الأشياء كل يوم، كل يوم الصبح والمغرب.
Suleiman's village, Safuri, does not exist anymore. It was destroyed in the War of 1948. Safuri, the Palestinian village, was built on the ruins of the ancient Jewish Sephoris. This picture was taken by the archaeological team that came here in the summer of 1931, 3 years before Suleiman's birth. Leroy Waterman, a professor from the University of Michigan, led the first archaeological expedition to unearth the ancient Jewish city. Like so many archaeologists who came before him, Leroy was a devout Christian. He felt he was a traveler in a biblical landscape. He imagined Safuri as the city on the hill from Jesus' sermons. For him, Safuri was barely visible. The ancient Jewish town of Sephoris that Leroy Waterman began to unearth had evolved since the 7th century into a bustling, primarily Muslim village with a population of more than 5,000 people. Slowly, the ancient city was coming to life, and soon it would devour the present-day Safuri. The village was occupied on July the 16th, 1948, as part of the last phase of what Israel calls its War of Independence. The Palestinian villagers fled. Their village was destroyed, and they were barred from returning. The ruins are now part of a national park. The village's history and its Muslim past are barely mentioned in the park's museum, formerly one of Safuri's schools on whose yard Leroy Waterman began his dig.
ספוריה בתקופה הערבית המוסלמית הייתה אחד המקומות החשובים באזור, אפילו בארץ, ובתקופות מסוימות הייתה מרכז של האזור, מרכז אדמיניסטרטיבי. ההרס של הכפר ב-1948 הוא כמובן הרס של כפר גדול ומשגשג, בעצם זריקת אנשים מהבית שלהם, אבל מעבר לזה יש בו גם אובדן היסטורי עצום, אובדן של רצף, של המשכיות, של פלורליזם היסטורי, של רב-גוניות של התמונה ההיסטורית וההסתכלות ההיסטורית, ובעצם ניסיון, מאז יש ניסיון להנצחה של הנרטיב האחד, החד-גוני והעלמת האחרים.
This village cemetery escaped destruction only after a long legal battle. To Muslims, it has historical significance as the resting place of some of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad.
בכפר הזה גדל אל-בידאווי, אחד מששת הפרשנים החשובים ביותר של הקוראן. אני מרגיש כלפי כל ניסיון למחוק, למזער, להסתיר, להדיר את האחר, זה עושה לי צביטה בלב. זה עושה לי צביטה בלב. אני חושב מחויבות כהיסטוריון להראות לאנשים את הרב-גוניות. הרי היסטוריה נועדה כדי ללמד אנשים ללמוד איך לחיות. ומרבדים, רב-גוניות ותמונה פנורמית של ההיסטוריה מלמדת את האנשים על סובלנות, איך לחיות ואיך לקבל את האחר ולחיות אותו בשלום.
There are many missing pieces in the story of this village of both Jewish and Arab heritage. But the only clear evidence of an actual exile is that of Suleiman and the 5,000 other Palestinians in 1948. Is it possible that some of these refugees are distant descendants of the Jewish population of Sepphoris who were never exiled?
أنا ما فهمتهاش كيف فهمتها كيف أنا بفهمها اليوم بالمرة. أنا حتى أنا كنت أفكر شخصيا كيف تفكيري كان وأنا صغير، كنت أفكر كل الدنيا إسلام وفي بكل بلد في دير، ما كنتش أفهم إنه في مسيحية وفي يهود، في كل العالم هي إسلام. هيك كنت أفهم، يعني هذا كان تفكيري صحيح.
لأنه ما كانش عندنا مسيحية.
ما كنتش لا كان مسيحية ولا حتى كان عندنا دير، أنا فكرت الدير هو إسلام، وأنا ما كنتش أفهم شو إسلام ومسيحية ويهود والإسلام كلها نفس الشيء، هيك كنت أفكر.
Evidence of the multi-ethnic history of the region can be found everywhere in the Galilee. In a town only a few kilometers from Sepphoris, a local journalist takes visitors to an ancient grave of a Jewish rabbi who has been revered for over a millennia by the mostly Muslim population. Local women still hang these rags, seeking a blessing from the rabbi.
למשל, אני רוצה שהבן שלי אז, שיהיה מורה בית ספר, או שהוא ילמד בית ספר. אלוהים, צדיק, תעזור לי. אז אנחנו שמים את זה אחד חדש וחוזרים הביתה פסיכולוגית, שבאמת הצדיק הזה הוא יעזור לנו. صديق صديق تعبير ليد صديق تعبير ليد صديق האמת שלא שאלתי אם זה יהודי או מוסלמי. צדיק זה צדיק לכולם.
For centuries, the peasants of Safuri preserved this grave, believed by some to be that of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Sepphoris's most important scholar. The rabbi helped transform Sepphoris into one of the most important spiritual centers of Judaism after the fall of Jerusalem.
The job of historians isn't to crush memory. It's not to destroy it. It's actually to hold it up and pull it apart without necessarily standing in the way of those people who want to put it back together afterwards. I think that it's the job of historians to remind people what's at stake in their shared memories. That is, what the effects of those shared memories are and what use they can be put to. But I think that there's actually some, moral urgency and seriously in what historians do, in taking these things and analyzing them and showing how far they can be from, ascertainable historical realities of the past. That there's, go on believing your myths, but at least understand what you're doing by doing that.
What is being unearthed in the ruins of Sepphoris and Sepphori is a message of hope and a warning. The promise of hope from a town that survived for hundreds of years because of its capacity to embrace many cultures and traditions. And a warning, written in the destruction brought about by adopting a single narrative of history at the expense of others.